Welcome back to the Radical Christ. It's been a while. I took a break in recording the series for two reasons. The most important one was that my mom passed away at 90 years of age after a wonderful life and a good death. But I gave myself some time just to mourn her passing. And then at the same time, I've also have been upskilling myself with some of the latest production software that makes my life a little easier on this end in terms of recording. So there is a whole new look. There's a new logo, the Radical Christ. Couple of disclaimers. The one is that the explosion is not so much about anarchy and violence. It's more of the notion of Jesus being so radical, the radical ideas that I'm wanting us to contemplate of this archetypal, ancient, and let's be honest, largely discounted person in history. So we're not going after the historical Jesus because Albert Schweitzer proved very early on in the 19th century that is very difficult to do. To find the historical Jesus is almost impossible. The Christ of dogma has become so locked into Christology and theology that it's been so contained by the church that we really are having to have a fresh look. And I'm coming at the radical, the Jesus that goes to the root, coming at Jesus from a way that'll hopefully blow up your mind in the same way that Jesus in his teaching blew up people's ideas in his day and throughout history, where people have had the courage to connect with the radical nature of Jesus. They have had that mind-blowing experience. So I am very informed in this process by the work of Carl Jung, who is kind of one of my archetypal teachers, mentors. Although I've never met him, he died in 1963. But his work has deeply influenced me, and he in turn was deeply influenced by Gnosticism. And for me, that has opened a whole door that was shut by my theological training. We were taught Gnosticism has nothing to teach us. I think over time we have come to realize that it's not so important to what you believe, but what you know. And the Greek word is gnosso, to know. And so that's why we're continuing this journey with the Radical Christ, looking at the life of Jesus as an archetypal map, because Jesus experienced everything that we humans have experienced. And so when we go and look at the life of Jesus in the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, or the Gnostic Gospels, we will discover insights into our own life, because the truth is that the only reality that exists for all of us is the reality that we are conscious of. We create our reality every morning when we wake up and we put our feet on the ground. We create a reality that believes that everything around us is real. And that is a neurological thing we do. But the truth is that Jesus came and said to us, all that we've projected outwards and pushing God further and further away up into the sky God, as Carolyn Mace talks about, the gods that are no longer useful. The sky God was the one that Jesus brought back in and incarnated, infleshed, and then said, this God and the reign of this God is within you. It's here. And so that's a radical thought in itself. So that's just to kind of upskill us a bit and bring us to, after this lull, just to remind us the path that we're on. We're in phase 2 of Jesus' life, his active ministry. We've looked at the miracles and the acts of signs and wonders that were pointing to the reality that God is present amongst God's people within us. And today we're going to be looking at the parables. The parables as those stories that Jesus told. I've been very informed for this particular segment, this particular episode, by the work of Dominic Crossan, the Roman Catholic scholar who's a member of the Jesus 2000 seminar. If you want to Google Jesus 2000 seminar, fascinating body of work where they went through the canonical Gospels, looking at what can we assume is actually teachings that Jesus gave, and what has just been layered on afterwards by the church. And Dominic Crossan was very much part of the Jesus 2000 seminar, as was Marcus Borg, his Lutheran counterpart, and many other scholars. So Dominic Crossan has got a very useful understanding of the parables, and it's that I want us to unpack just a little bit today, because we all love the parables, don't we? Tell me the stories of Jesus, I love to hear. The good old hymn that we used to sing in Sunday school and in church. Tell me the stories of Jesus. Jesus was a storyteller. He used stories to illustrate. And so I want us to have look a little more closely at parables as stories. So let's move to that. So the parables are stories that are told by Jesus, but parables are things that humans tell, because we are inveterate storytellers. We tell stories about everything. We talk about the meaning of our life by telling stories, and we try to understand everything in terms of speaking about it in stories. So one could say that stories are actually maps of meaning. They direct the meaning of our life. They give us purpose and direction. And we tell stories all the time. In fact, our life is a story. It's a narrative. It's a story inside our heads, and the life we live tells a story to other people. And a beautiful quote that I came across when I was conducting the funeral of my mom, the virtual one online, was a saying by Stephen Jenkinson that once the manner of your dying will be the most autobiographical act you will ever make. The manner of your dying is the most autobiographical act you will ever make. It's a story. Your whole life is a story, of which your dying is the final autobiographical chapter. And so it is in that sense that parables are metaphor stories. A metaphor is a symbol to help us to understand something deeper. And so that is how we as humans, since we learn to communicate, have functioned. We tell stories, and Jesus told stories. And so one can say at one level that all scripture is stories. The whole Bible, and not just the Bible, all the major world's religions are collections of stories that are told. Teaching stories, moral stories, stories for guidance, political stories, power stories. They're all stories. And they then get collected into what we then regard as our scripture. And so we come now to Dominic Crossan. As I have introduced him to you, member of the Jesus 2000 seminar, and he's written a very interesting book on the parables, and it's titled How Stories Jesus Told Became Stories About Jesus. And he makes this really useful distinction. He speaks about how Jesus told parables about God, and so many of the parables that Jesus tells begin with the phrase, "The kingdom of heaven is like this. Behold, a sower went out to sow. The kingdom of heaven is like this." A parabolic story, a metaphor to explain the reality of what Jesus is trying to teach. making the abstract concrete in a story that people can relate to. And of course, Mark says he taught only in parables to those in the crowds, but to those who had deeper understanding. And here we get into the Gnostic idea that there was another level of teaching that has not been written down. The Gnostics would say, well, that was a direct transmission. And that's where contemplation comes in the whole mystical dimension. But at face value, we begin with the iconic story, and then as we contemplate that story, we distill it into its more contemplative understanding. And we'll say more about that as the course goes along. But just to give you an example of this parable, the stories Jesus told about God. Let's take an example, and Crossan uses this one very well. He says, have a look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. So it's a story about a man was journeying from Jerusalem to Jericho, a notoriously dangerous road. There was all sorts of brigands and violent people, hijackers we would call them, who waited to prey on people coming from the temple. And so this man gets beaten up and robbed, and he's left lying for dead. And then the priest comes past, and the priest takes a look and doesn't go near the body because he doesn't want to defile himself. These days with COVID behind the masks, we understand that kind of social distancing. It's part of our life again, where everybody's regarded as infectious and some kind of leper. So that's the priest avoids going near the body. Then the Levite, the scholar of the law, comes past also. So these very faithful, respectable, righteous people just pass the wounded man by. And then Jesus says a Samaritan comes. Now the Samaritan would have been a despised person, a less than human person, a person of a low caste, certainly in the Jewish culture of the day. The very righteous Jewish culture of Jesus' day. And Jesus takes a story to show how somebody who's really rejected by the rest of society can actually be the bringer of grace and of compassion. So that's the Good Samaritan parable that Jesus told. And none of us believes that that Good Samaritan story is anything other than a story. We're not going to go looking for what was the name of the Samaritan, where did he come from, did Jesus know him, where is he buried, because we know it was a parable. There really was no Good Samaritan. Is the story true? Absolutely true. It's the truth about how one finds godly nature often in the most unexpected situations and in people that you wouldn't expect to be compassionate. So that's the Good Samaritan, a parable about God that Jesus told. Now the next thing that Crossan looks at is another journey story. This time it's the story of the journey on the road to Emmaus. This is recorded in the Gospel as what happens after the resurrection. Two of the disciples are going from Jerusalem, but this time to Emmaus, not to Jericho as the Good Samaritan was going. Journeying along, they talk to each other about all the terrible things that have happened. It's just after Jesus has been crucified, and there's been talk about the resurrection, when a stranger comes up and joins them as they journey along the way. The stranger is, of course, Jesus in resurrected form. They don't recognize him. Unusual. Disciples of Jesus don't recognize him. They walk along the way, and Jesus pretends not to know what's going on, and so they begin to explain, and they say to him, are you the only person who doesn't know what's happened? And they tell about the Messiah who had come and how he'd been killed and all this terrible thing, and we had hoped that he was going to save Israel, and now it's all gone to nothing. And then Jesus pretends to pass by Emmaus, but it's getting late. They invite him inside, and as he breaks the bread at supper that he shares with them in their hospitality, in the breaking of the bread, they recognize Jesus. Of course, there's a strong element there of the early church's Holy Communion, Eucharistic ritual, the breaking of the bread, and the recognition. And of course, there's an underpinning theme of that every time we break the bread, Jesus is with us. That's why Holy Communion and the Eucharist and the Mass continue up until this present day. Crossan asks the question, if the Good Samaritan is clearly in our minds not a historical story, it's a true metaphorical story, why do we expect the Road to Emmaus story to be literally true? Because they really are two parables. And so the unique insight that Crossan has come to about the parables is that Jesus told parables about God, like the Good Samaritan. The church then continued in that tradition, telling parables about Jesus, like the Road to Emmaus. But we want these to be literal, and we can't believe that these might also just be parables, post-crucifixion parables that the church told themselves. Are those stories true? Absolutely, they're true. Let me give you an example. I think we all know that very well known, it's printed on 100 funeral leaflets, of footprints, how the person had a dream and they see two sets of footprints walking along the beach, and they say, what is this? And God says, that is the story of your life. All as you were walking along your life, I was walking right next to you. And then at a point in the dream, the person sees that there's only one set of footprints and says, but why is there only one set of footprints here? Is this when you abandoned me? And God or Jesus says, no, that's the time that I carried you. That's why there's only one set of footprints. We all love the story. Is it a true story? It's absolutely true. There are times when God carries us. We have a sense of the divine supporting us and carrying us. Did it actually happen? No, we don't need it to happen to be true. And yet, there is this problem here that Crossan points out, that the parables about Jesus, somehow we demand that they must be taken literally. And we can't live with the challenge of taking it mythically, taking it as a parable. So, it begs the question as to why we require such literalism. And that's why I want us to reflect just a little bit, using what Crossan is inviting us to do, that maybe everything is a parable. And so I want to ask just a few contemplative questions as we close out today. What if all of life is a parable about life? How even me sitting here in COVID lockdown, far away from many of you in South Africa, telling you stories about Jesus and the radical Christ, it's a parable about life. COVID-19 is a parable about life. We haven't quite unpacked its meaning, but we are very sure that we will tell our children, and their children will tell their children, of what happened in 2020 when the whole world hid away from an unseen enemy called COVID-19. It's a parable. It teaches us so many things. I certainly, in the time that I have not been producing this content, have learnt a lot about myself and gone through many changes, through grieving my mom, through changes in my own life. What if all of life, every experience, is a parable? Something we can learn from, and something that points to something bigger. And that's what the mystics knew. That's what the contemplatives knew. That's what people who have a direct gnostic connection with the divine have always known. that there can be this wonderful experience of everything in life having meaning if we will just look at it all as a parable. Wonderful, wonderful, the stories of our life. Because if everything in life is a parable about life, and notice life is with a capital L, right? Life, that word that I find sometimes more comfortable to use than the word for God, because it's not some white old man with a beard sitting on a throne. It's life. It's all around. That's divine. That is God. God is life. Then everything that happens, all of life, the pain and the pleasure, the agony and the ecstasy, the love and experience of anger and hatred, the viciousness and the compassion, all of it is a teacher. As my Buddhist friends would say, everything is a Dharma. Drive all Dharmas into one. See everything as your teacher. Everything is true. Your life is true. My life is true. It's a true story, and it's a story about life. So whether I'm looking at a flower, or whether I'm looking at a beautiful animal, or I'm looking at my pet, or I'm looking at my plant, or I'm looking at myself, I'm seeing life, and I'm seeing a parable that points to something bigger, something more mysterious, more divine. And so I'd like to leave you today with a question, a simple question. And it's prompted by something that Carl Jung says he spent most of his life thinking about. In Memories, Dreams and Reflections, his autobiography, he writes, I have spent most of my life asking myself, what is the myth that I am living? What is the underpinning myth, the underpinning story that tells the story of my life? And if I can just loop back to the parables of Jesus, the parables Jesus talked about God, we've all got favorite ones. So for many people, the favorite parable is the prodigal son. The son who gets found and brought home, or the lost sheep, or the lost coin, or the Good Samaritan. We've got a favorite parable. So can I ask, what is the parable that your life is telling the rest of the world about life and about God and about you? If you were to capture the story of your life, write it down, tell it as a story, what would it be pointing to? What is the parable? What is the metaphor? Why has this life of Peter shown up at this time? What is its message? What is it pointing to? So I'll leave you with that question. What is the parable that your life and my life is telling about life? For the people who experience us. And what does our life offer and teach and point to? So thank you for your attention, and it's been lovely to be back with you again, and hopefully I'll see you soon, and thank you once again for your attention.